All right. So I want to start. I want to start briefly with acknowledging the territory from which my talk is coming.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, so it looks like, Ryan, you might have crashed. Okay, it looks like it's on his end. Yep, okay.
I'm here. Did I?
You completely froze.
Awesome.
Okay, but I think you're back now.
Okay. So let's. All right. So let's. Luckily, let's start reading again. All right. Pushing all these weird buttons. Start getting my screen back to where I can see things. Part of the contentious nature of the wrestling reel is a function of wrestling as a form. It sits uneasily at the junction of sports and performance art, with the particulars of its specific presentation at a given moment determining which direction it leans. New Japan Pro Wrestling's presentation emphasized the trappings of sport, while Lucha Underground embraced a pulpy cinematic aesthetic that leaned heavily into wrestling as art. Most other promotions fall somewhere between these two poles. And the major North American promotions, AEW, WWE, Impact, often seem to transverse this space between in the course of a single show. This is how we can see Lesnar, McIntyre on the same card as Bray Wyatt and John Cena's Firefly Funhouse match, or how AEW's ranking system can operate in the same space where broken Matt Hardy teleports to the ring. Wrestling looks like a sport, but because the outcomes are predetermined and the athletic feats are couched within the communication of a specific narrative, it isn't quite. Wrestling operates like a performance art, but its attachment to the trappings of sport, specifically wins, losses, and championships, is such that it can't fully embrace. I'll share my slide now. It's such that it can't fully embrace its theatricality. Conveniently, Roland Barthes provides us with a way out of this problem. In his essay, The World of Wrestling, Barthes argues that, quote, wrestling is not a sport, it is a spectacle. And further, that the wrestler's function is, quote, to go exactly through the motions which are expected of him, unquote. And while it can certainly be suggested that sport itself is spectacular, Bart's assertion means that wrestling's legitimacy is secondary to the social function it performs or the social relations it encodes. As Guy Debord explains in The Society of the Spectacle, quote, the spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people, mediated by images. And this mediation, while functionally a representation that displaces the directly lived, is experienced as a real. Wrestling's reels are mediated. There's no direct access to the totality of the thing happening, and it is thus impossible to engage the objective event of the match or the show directly. The wrestlers know the finish. They may know all the beats and moves of the match, or they may improvise everything leading to the finish. But their experience is limited to what they see, hear, and feel in the ring. Similarly, the audience does not know the outcome, though it may anticipate or desire specific ones, and can only react to the event as experienced from the position of the spectator, booing and cheering in reaction to the actions of the wrestlers. This feedback, as we've seen in some of the awkward transitions to crowdless wrestling, necessitated by the current global pandemic, is an essential part of the experience. This is true both for the wrestlers, who are working to produce specific emotional reactions in the crowd, and for the crowd itself, because it experiences and reacts to its own collective response. This shapes its perception of the match. If the match or event is televised or otherwise broadcast, another layer is added as the live audience is an aesthetic feature of the experience for the home audience. As anyone who has watched a good match with a dead crowd, or had to adapt to watching wrestling in other countries where specific different social orders are at play, can surely testify to, the crowd is a crucial part of the home viewing experience. For example, if you've ever tried to watch Japanese wrestling, when you are not used to Japanese crowds, it's a little disorienting. The reels produced by wrestling are polyvalent and heteroglossic. As Mikhail Bakhtin notes, the heteroglot, quote, represents the coexistence of socio-ideological contradictions between the past and the present, between differing epochs of the past, between different socio-ideological groups in the present, between tendencies, school, circles, and so forth, all given a bodily form, unquote. Simply put, what this means is that the text, in our case, professional wrestling, is always already composed of a number of competing languages and experiences that are dependent on both the position of the viewer in relation to the text and the viewer's knowledge and experience to become comprehensible. Wrestling's reality is then a highly subjective one, and the truth that the observer experiences is a product
God, I
of
want to
their
send this to the live fan guys so bad.
specific point of view. In this way, the realities operating within professional wrestling, the documentary reel. In comparison with wrestling, the documentary's truth claim in comparison with wrestling, the documentary's truth claims are seemingly far less fraught. They're rooted in an experience of the archival. The documentary seeks to represent a historical truth, a thing that has happened or is happening. The events recorded by the documentary filmmaker or photographer are things that happen at a specific moment in time. And the film captures and records that moment as it happens. The documentary text, like James Agee and Walker Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, works to capture the people and the space they represent as they are fully and completely as possible. And occasionally we see, as we see in Canadian poet Robert Croce's documentary poem, The Ledger, works to preserve the presence of the documents they engage throughout the text. And while the critical or theoretical treatment of these objects may be more complex, the popular understanding of the documentary is largely uncritical of its truth claims. They depict real events that really happen using, and this is especially true of film and photography, technologies that are understood as not understood as subjective, and as a result present something that is accepted as true, something that contains reality. This idea, of course, misunderstands the supposed neutrality of the document with the mediation that necessarily operates in the documentary. A documentary, like all text, is marked by the author. Someone makes a documentary. They do not arise organically or accidentally. And these acts of composition represent what Michel Foucault refers to as, quote, the principle of thrift in the proliferation of meaning. Here is what is an author and his potential death, their potential death arising. Cutting off possible experiences of the event or thing being documented. The audience's experience of that which is being represented is mediated by the choices, the position of the film stock, the editing made by the documentarian. As Paula Rabinowitz notes in her book, They Must Be Represented, quote, and this is a long one, that's why it's on the screen, in its supposedly purest form, documentary sought to represent reality, including the inner reality of the subject through precise selection of objects surveyed by the camera and sounds recorded by the microphone. Objectivity produced subjective truths. What the filmmaker saw and heard of any event was what the film viewer would ultimately see. The visible and audible renderings of real life hold a powerful claim to truth in contrast to the scripted, performed, staged, costume, key-lit, fictionalized, in short, artificial images of classical narrative cinema. And arguably, you would suggest wrestling occupies this space as well. Yet narrative also makes a claim to reality, to reveal something truthful about the working of human emotion. Thus, the close-up heightens emotional intensity, the 180-degree rule sutures the viewer into the scenic space, a match on action maintains temporal flow, and so forth. What Rabinowitz works to do here is collapse the distance between the documentary and narrative cinema, and to reveal that though the elements of their construction, through the elements of their construction, they both work to produce truths that are essentially subjective. The implication is that despite the supposed objectivity of the microphone and the camera, the documentary uses aesthetic elements, and it is worth noting that documentary film uses much of the same visual language as narrative film in order to produce its reel. Like in wrestling, the objective event being observed can only be experienced from one position at a time, which in documentary film is represented by the position of the camera. For the viewer, their experience of that event is shaped by their position in relation to it. And that experience is not the totality of the thing, but rather an aspect of it shaped and framed by such seemingly innocent decisions as where the camera happens to be set up and what it is pointed at. Hard cameras on the one, the hard cameras on the one side. Canadian poet Dorothy Livesay, in her essay, The Documentary Poem, a Canadian Genre, addresses this mediation and locates it at the heart of documentary production. Livesay suggests that the documentary poet, quote, creates a dialectic between the objective facts and the subjective feelings of the poet. And the effect is often ironic, it is always intensely personal, unquote. The reader is always at least one remove from that which is being depicted. The documentarian potentially at a similar remove as Livesay's own work suggests, and their experience is always already shaped by the point of view of another. The thing may be real, but it is highly mediated. The documentary poem further reveals the mediation at work in the documentary because, as a poem, it is never experienced as anything but aesthetic. As both Keats and Poe noted in the 19th century, poetry's truth claim is rooted in beauty, or rather, the aesthetic experience. The documentary is an aesthetic mode that, while attempting to claim or gesturing towards an objective truth, is, as Rabinowitz notes, quote, persuasive, not simply artifactual, unquote. It produces a real, a truth, not the real, or the truth. And the real produced is one that has been shaped and mediated. The persuasiveness, the constructiveness of the documentary reel is what leads us back to wrestling. The match of the show is constructed and mediated, intended to persuade those that engage with it. Of certain truth. But what those truths are and how they are understood is shaped by a dialectic similar to the one Livesay described. I want us to consider for a moment this photograph by Walker Evans. We'll just take it in for a second. And then this is part of Evans' project with James Agee, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, where the two men went to Alabama in 1935 and 1936 to document the lives of sharecroppers. The photograph we are looking at is entitled Part of Burroughs Cotton, Louise Burroughs Picking.
Are you there?
I'm here, yes.
And that is seemingly what it
depicts.
depicts.
Today is the inaugural first conference of the Professional Wrestling Studies Association.
The cotton
which
plants
I am a
are
founding
authentic
member.
and belong
It's all
to,
being done online, but it was always going to be done online.
and belong to the Burroughs family. So
And-
that is Burroughs
I'm
cotton,
having
and
a
that's
kind of
what we're looking at.
mixed moment of, oh dear God, the array of graduate student papers that are.
The girl depicted in the photo is Lucille Burroughs. And those are, as near as I can tell, those are her clothes. That is a real cotton bag for picking cotton. Everything in this is real. So when seen at a glance, within the context of the documentary, this photograph reads as real. It's a real photo depicting a real thing. However, if we look really closely, we'll notice an anomaly. There's something off about this photo that kind of speaks to how the documentary reel can inform the wrestling reel. This can't be a depiction of Lucille Burroughs picking cotton because there's no cotton to be picked. Those are cotton plants, but there's no cotton. It's out of season. Evans staged the photo to depict a reel that was temporarily unavailable. This shouldn't necessarily come as a shock because this type of thing is a regular feature of the documentary throughout history. Robert Flaherty is known to have staged sequences in Nanook of the North in 1922, and the 1958 Walt Disney film White Wilderness's infamous lemming scene was a fabrication shot more or less in downtown Calgary and not the Arctic. But it does show the power of documentary truth claim or feeling of authenticity. It is also what those of us familiar with the language of wrestling would recognize as a work. It performs or constructs a situation that is to be and is interpreted as real in order to create an effect in the observer. The presentation of the photo is such that the authentic elements allow for the constructed ones to be elided. The real produced is mediated, but still real. No, that's the wrong button. There we go. We see this in wrestling all the time. The rise and fall of the Mega Powers, the team of Macho Man Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, works as a long-term narrative because while the specific action presented to the reader, or to the viewer, is a work, the relationships depicted by all accounts mirror the performer's relationship. Randy Savage is widely reputed, to have been possessive and jealous and controlling in his relationship with Elizabeth. And if we look back, his relationship with Hulk Hogan is best described as fraught. When viewed from the position of the observer, in this case, we can imagine an 8-year-old me as a little, this is the observer we're imagining, 8-year-old me, a little Hulkamaniac, watching this. The performance, when deploying the elements that we can understand, I lost my sentence. When viewed from the position of the observer, the performance deploying elements that we can understand as authentic or feel authentic, the performance produces a reality. No doubt, the real experience by Hogan, Savage, and Elizabeth was different from the one I experienced, but they both stem from the subjective engagement with the objective occurrence. 3 people in a wrestling ring engaging what looks like sport and feels like melodrama.